All right, good morning. I'm sorry I can't be there to talk with you about structural violence in person. This is one of my favorite topics to cover. But I'm in Colorado for a job interview, so wish me luck on that interview. And in the meantime, let's talk about structural violence. So, as always, we're going to revisit the violence pyramid like we do for every unit. We've kind of covered some of those lower levels, those bottom levels. We're going to look now at discrimination kind of more in depth. We haven't really talked about it too much. In Unit 1, we kind of highlighted these attitudes and beliefs and some of these acts of prejudice. And in Unit 2, we talked about them as well. I was talking about explicitly violent acts. We'll talk about genocide for the next week that we meet in person, which should be in 2 weeks. But for now, we're going to really look more into discrimination and more in depth. So, what is structural violence? Take a minute, before I get through to the rest of the slide and think about it. I'm going to give you a brief background. It was coined by the researcher you see there. I'm not going to try to butcher the pronunciation of their name. And structural violence is hidden or subtle, and most of the violence we've talked about in this course so far isn't in your face, and I do that on purpose because we can talk about straight up assault, in a number of other classes, but we don't take as much time to talk about some of the types of violence we don't necessarily see in everyday life, or we don't think about as violence necessarily. It's difficult to pinpoint, so it's easy to say, oh, this person punched me in the face because I'm black, it's a hate crime. Maybe it's not as easy, but it's easier to say that than, this person denied me a job because I'm Hispanic and I have a Hispanic name, despite the fact that studies have shown that there is a bias against people with quote-unquote, minority names, and they're not less likely to get things like jobs or public housing or other sorts of things where you have to apply for those things. It's based on inequality, just like every other kind of violence we've kind of talked about in this class. We don't really talk about sort of random quote-unquote acts of violence. Now, structural violence is the root cause of the difference between one's potential reality and their actual circumstances, and I'll talk more about what that means in just a minute, but that's important to know. If you know one thing, I want you to know this. So an example of this could be one's potential versus actual life expectancy. So say the life expectancy in the United States is, I think, in the high 70s or low 80s. I think it differs between men and women for a number of reasons, but say it's 78. If you live on a reservation, say some of my family lives on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The life expectancy there is in the 40s. They still live in the United States. They're a couple states away from us. It's not like they're in a different country with different cultural values. Now, reservations have some cultural values that are different, but they still live in the U.S., but their life expectancy is in the 40s for a number of structural reasons. There's high levels of poverty, there's low resources, there's really high unemployment, there's a lot of structural factors that come into play. Now, this structures and these inequality overlaps with socioeconomic status, so how much money you make, your race, your gender, your ability status, etc. They overlap with those us versus them groups that we've kind of hammered multiple times throughout this course. Now, in structural violence, people are disadvantaged by political, legal, economic, or cultural traditions. So they're not necessarily disadvantaged, on an individual level, but at a mass group level. Violence occurs without direct individual action. So I'm not going up and punching people in the face. I am, part of a group where the culture is to deny Black people housing because there's a thought that Black people won't pay rent on time because they don't work good jobs or whatever. A person's life expectancy, going back to that example, might be shortened by an act of direct personal violence. If you go up and stab somebody, then their life expectancy has gotten a lot shorter. Or the failure of a system to provide adequate care. So if they got stabbed somewhere where there was a level 1 trauma center, say somewhere north side of Chicago, decent level 1 trauma centers, and they can go in and get life-saving care, and they have good insurance, they'll be fine. Hopefully. Now, say that same person was stabbed somewhere where there is no level 1 trauma center, south side of Chicago, west side of Chicago, and they can't get access to the hospital, or it takes 45 minutes to drive there, they die on the way. Or they get there, but they don't have insurance, so they can't afford follow-up care, and they die anyway from other sort of side effects. That's structural violence. That's taking away somebody's agency because of the structures that exist in Chicago, in which more resources and opportunities are provided for some neighborhoods in Chicago than they are for others. Another example, a person may be prevented from attending school by an act of another individual. So, my kid's getting bullied by another kid and they don't want to go to school, or resources being diverted away from education. In a very timely manner, the Chicago public school teachers strike prevented a lot of kids from going to school because teachers were striking for not only better pay, but also to have nurses and social workers in the school, and to, make sure kids weren't homeless. This, again, is structural violence. Those who benefit might not be aware of the harm. So structural violence is similar to when we talked about microaggressions and implicit bias. People don't necessarily know that they're committing harm. There are definitely people who are committing structural violence, but there are people who don't. So, if you've moved to a neighborhood where things are gentrifying, you might benefit from getting a cool apartment in an up-and-coming neighborhood. Well, you may or may not be aware that you're pushing out the people who have lived in that neighborhood for 50 years, but they can't afford the rent anymore. Again, you might not be aware of the harm of it, but there is harm being occurred. So we talk about structural violence, but we need to know what some of those structures are. So take a minute if you need to and just think about some of the quote-unquote structures of structural violence. One of them may be education, healthcare, we've talked about both of those, housing, employment, and there may be other ones that I just don't think of that you could come up with as well. Incarceration, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So here's an example, this sort of circular graphic I've got going on. So the top circle, if you look, and it says poor children, inadequate schools. So say, you lived in a low-income area, whether or not it's in a city or in a rural area, and you went to public school. Now, a lot of public schools in the United States, if not all of them, and I might be wrong, are funded by our taxes. And so if you live in a low-income area, people may not be paying as much tax because we have a progressive tax rate in this country, and therefore they don't have as much money for their schools as somewhere where there's a heavy tax laid on people. Unless you're Jeff Bezos and you don't pay any taxes, and that's a whole other conversation. But so you go to this school that's not very well funded, that books are 20 years old, there's maybe a nurse who rotates among 3 or 4 schools, your library's falling apart, your buildings haven't been updated in 20 years or 30 years or more. So you're going to poor schools, and the teachers are underpaid, there's high turnover, so you're getting a different teacher every year. The teachers don't have resources to dedicate to individual students, so you're just kind of lumped in with everybody regardless of how well you're doing or how much attention you need for, if you're struggling with things. So you go through that school system and you go to apply to college or apply to jobs or whatever the case may be. You can't get into college because your GPA wasn't that great because you just didn't have the resources you needed to succeed. You couldn't get to tutoring because there was no tutoring offered. They just taught to pass a standardized test, and there were no resources to do other things. So you can't get to college, so you can't get a quote-unquote good job. Or you don't have the capabilities to apply to trade school because there are definitely options beyond college. So you get limited access to these quote-unquote good jobs. That means that you become a poor adult, so you have limited access to the good health care and the good housing. Well, then, you have poor kids and they go to inadequate schools, and then the cycle continues. It is very difficult to break that cycle of poverty. So, like, if any of you are first-gen kids who are going to college, if your parents came from a low-income background, you know it's very, very difficult to break that, because even if you are going to college and you get that quote-unquote good job, you still might have to support your family who is struggling, and you want to support your family. So this becomes built into the structures of our society. So these groups see that there's ways we can take advantage of that poverty, regulations for food stamps, or regulations for jobs, or incarcerating folks for any number of petty reasons, and then it becomes a structural violence issue. So when we think about structural violence and morality, and this comic here says, sorry, I'm morally opposed to filling your birth control prescription, but your boyfriend there looks like he could stand a dose of Viagra. We think about the us versus them groups that we've repeated throughout the course, and structural violence determines who is quote-unquote good or deserving and who is quote-unquote bad or undeserving. Think about how that overlaps with the us versus them groups. We would think that the us group is good or deserving of whatever benefits our society offers: a good job, decent pay, healthcare, and then other luxuries. And the people who don't have access to those don't deserve them. So you often hear, like, why do poor people get government handouts? Why, I have to work for what I get. We set up this narrative that the them group is undeserving of it, like we've talked about in other parts of the course. So one way to do this, one way to enact structural violence or to determine who is good and who is not, incarceration. And I know that's a terrible sound effect, but I thought it was fun. So we're going to talk about incarceration. The rest of this lecture sounds like I'm going on a tangent, but I'm not. I promise you I will come back and tie it nicely up in the end. So feel free to pause, rewind, go back and forth through the slides as you need to, because I'll take sort of a circuitous route to get to the main point. So I want to get into the context of how we got into this mass incarceration problem that we have in the country, because we do have one. So we're going to take a step back to go through that. So there was a big decline of the manufacturing industry in the 1970s as we started to shift more towards becoming a service economy. And so, for example, New York City lost 170,000 blue-collar jobs, so factory jobs. Chicago lost 120,000 of those jobs. Most of the people who were working there were men of color or low-income white folks. Well-to-do white folks didn't work blue-collar jobs. They worked as managers or whatever else. Employment rates fell 20 to 40% for young Black urban men. Because remember, these men came, those two waves of Black migration to Chicago, other northern places got those as well, came post-World War II, got a job at a factory, made decent, back then you could make a decent wage in a factory job, while 1970s, manufacturing starts shutting down and bunches of people lose their jobs. Well, they don't have the skills to get new jobs because they've been working in factory jobs for 20 years. So they lose their jobs, and there was this de-unionization. So the unions sort of fell apart as we shifted away from manufacturing. And this contributed to wage losses of urban workers, because unions play an important role in fighting for the wages of people that are part of the union, as you've probably seen if you've lived in Chicago for any period of time. The welfare institution was not equipped to handle these events. So you get all these Black men, Black and brown men, losing their jobs. They don't have the skills to get another job, and some of them might be, quote unquote, too old to go to college to get another job, or they don't have the money to go to college, so they go on welfare. Well, welfare wasn't built to handle this. The social services atrophied, so they really weakened. They were spread out really thin. And this is also tied to post-1960 social attitudes. So the 1970s came right after the civil rights movements of the 60s, and white folks were still a little insecure because, they weren't used to Black folks so blatantly uprising for their rights, and so there was a lot of fear at the time. So remember, lots of Black folks lost their jobs going on welfare. there were also social attitudes of the time that came right after the Civil Rights Movement. Also going on was a shift in politics in the mid-1960s, and this is a picture of Barry Goldwater. He was running for president in 1964, and part of his platform was that crime and disorder were threats to human freedom. And so this is sort of where this term law and order comes in. If you've heard, like, I'm the law and order candidate, I'll fight for law and order. This was really big in the 1960s. He placed the issue of crime on a national agenda, and prior to that, it wasn't. People focused on crime, but not to the extent that we do now. So we had elevated crime rates in the 1960s. There was a shifting race relations post-civil rights, and so this set a context for law and order politics, because black and brown folks getting uppity, we can't handle that. So this came in and sort of kick-started the war on drugs of the 1970s and 1980s. So we're going to take another little side trip where we're going to talk about drugs for a minute. So let's go over a primer. And this cartoon says, is it time to end the war on drugs? And there's a police officer with a bag saying bigger budgets, and he says no. There's a bank with a bag of money that says laundry, and he says no. There's a drug cartel guy, and he's holding a bag that says profits, and he says no. So, starting in the 1870s, drugs were pretty loosely regulated until this time. In the 1870s, there were some economic issues because this was, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, westward expansion, the whole shebang. There were also racial tensions because, that's the United States. There's always racial tensions. However, it was, yes, against blacks, but it was also against Chinese folks. A lot of Chinese folks were immigrating to the Pacific area, San Francisco, northern, California, Oregon, Washington, the western seafront, and these laws that the United States created targeted Chinese opium users as a means of racism, basically. White women used opium as well for whatever, women's issues were at the time, hysteria, fainting spells, whatever else they used to basically deny women any sort of agency in their medical history. But only the method of consumption used by the Chinese was banned, and so they used it in different ways. White women could use it just fine because their way of using it wasn't banned, but Chinese folks who were using it was banned. At the same time, remember this is Reconstruction, whites expressed fears of cocaine use among black folks. Cocaine's been around for a long time. Take a look at a bottle of cough syrup from the 1910s or Coca-Cola, and cocaine's been around for a long time. So we've got the beginning of regulation of drug use, but only for non-white people. So for Chinese who were immigrating to the West in the 1800s, and for blacks who were, supposedly using all this cocaine during Reconstruction. But they couldn't be regulated by slavery anymore, so we had to regulate them somehow. States were criminalizing these drugs, however, drugs weren't quite on the national radar. So they were starting to be regulated, but they weren't quite on the national radar yet. A fun fact for you, stay at a party. In the 1890s, Sears and Roebuck offered a syringe and small amounts of cocaine for $1.50. With inflation, I have no idea how much that would be now, more than I'd want to pay if I bought cocaine, which I don't. Hopefully you don't either. So we're going to jump ahead to the 1900s and 1950s. This is where we start to see the rise of the anti-drug policy. One of these laws, and there's kind of a lot of laws in here. If you want to look them up later or on your own, you're more than welcome to, but I'm not going to go into them too in depth. One of these is the Harrison Narcotic Drug Act of 1914, and this was kind of the start of national drug regulation. It required those selling opium and cocaine and their derivatives to register with the federal government and to pay a tax. When you think about who's selling opium and cocaine, it wasn't the white ladies. They were using it, they weren't selling it. What do you suppose this was driven by? Again, it wasn't the white ladies who were selling it, it was Chinese folks, it was black folks. Post-slavery, we can't regulate people via slavery anymore. We got to regulate them somehow in another way. So we're going to tax them. So the Bureau of Internal Revenue used the law as an opportunity to expand power, and they used the media to say that drugs were a danger and drug use was criminal. So this has been going on for a hot minute. Physicians continue this and talked about accidental versus recreational addicts. And this is going to shock all of you to say that accidental addicts were usually white and recreational addicts were usually not white. Prohibition and Marijuana Tax Act used similar strategies. So if you think about Prohibition in 1919, we started to ban alcohol because it was against the morals of the country. We saw these lawless folks doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Try to do the same thing to marijuana in the late 1930s. So these crackdowns led to the rise of black markets for drugs, because we all know Prohibition worked really well, as did the crackdown on marijuana. Worked great, right? Nobody uses those anymore. We're going to continue into the 1950s and 1970s. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, drug use among white folks was associated with youth, with communism and organized crime. Actually, drug use among anybody, I guess, was associated with youth, communism, and organized crime. That generation, people have been harping on the younger generation forever. Laws passed in the 1950s established mandatory minimum sentences. So if you were sentenced to prison for selling cocaine, you got, say, 5 years automatically, regardless of, what anybody thought. These mandatory minimums were especially imposed on heroin, which was popular among black men at the time. Because remember, at least in Chicago, organized crime groups introduced heroin to those street gangs of black men in the 1950s and 60s, and so these laws passed started to crack down on heroin usage. But some thought that the laws were too punitive and focused on punishment instead of rehabilitation. The criminal justice system in the United States has been sort of a pendulum, swinging between punishment and rehabilitation for forever, basically, since it was established. Expanded drug regulation and funding for treatment shifted the construction of drug users. And so we had these sort of laws, these punitive laws in the early 20th century, the 1900s through the 1950s, where drugs were associated with crime. And this was a result of the 1800s, starting to sort of crack down on these drug users, Well, post-Vietnam War, folks were coming back and, they were using drugs to cope with their traumas from Vietnam. There were a number of baby boomers coming of age in the 60s and 70s. They were disillusioned. Nobody really liked the Vietnam War. Nobody wanted it to happen. The politicians were viewed as corrupt. Not that that's any different now, but it was especially prevalent during that time, number of riots, number of civil rights issues. And so these baby boomers, started to use drugs recreationally, and they became sort of the face of drug use. Now, part of the reason there was a swing towards rehabilitation is because these users were whiter and wealthier than in the 1940s and 50s. So that changed again in the 1970s. So 50s, we started to see some rehabilitation. 70s, we're still seeing some rehabilitation. We have the Controlled Substance Act. It was a new classification system for drugs, which I think we still use today, increased resources for law enforcement, and it removed those mandatory minimums, and increased funding for drug treatment. And the power of enforcement shifted to the Attorney General. So we were seeing some rehabilitative attitudes as we see the face of drugs, so to speak, becoming whiter. But there's still, with the 60s and 70s, there's still this inkling of law and order. Remember with Barry Goldwater in 1964 talking about how drug use is viewed as criminal. And we need to really crack down on crime. And so it shifted to the Attorney General from the Federal Drug Administration. And of course, then the war on drugs really kicks off in 1971, and you can click on that link and view that on your own. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created in 1973, partially to deal with the war on drugs. And by the 1970s, the public began to fear an increase in drug addiction. So let's look at the 80s. I'm going to say most of you probably do not remember this DARE campaign. I definitely went through this DARE campaign. It was a massive fail, but people like to say that they did something about it. It was basically, dare to resist drugs, and they'd have people come into school and be like, if you use drugs, your brain's going to be fried, you're not going to get a good job, yada, yada, yada. Just say no. A lot of peer pressure. Again, didn't really work, but big campaign in the 80s and 90s. So Nixon really kind of kicked off the war on drugs in the 70s. Reagan continued it. Now, drug policy really focused on law and order at the time. The anti-drug rhetoric escalated. Law enforcement spending started to increase, and treatment and prevention spending went down. Punishing offenders to appear tough on crime was the norm. So mandatory minimum sentences return. Again, you get sentenced to a drug crime, you're going to get a minimum of 10 years or 5 years or 20 years or whatever. The punishments for crack increased while cocaine remained the same. Why do you think this is so? Take a minute if you're not sure. Well, crack increased because crack use was associated with black folks. Black folks were more likely to use crack, while cocaine was associated with white folks, and white folks were more likely to use it. So the punishments for what black folks used was higher than the punishment for what white folks used. So by the early 1990s, the attention to crack sort of subsided, but the anti-drug rhetoric remained popular. Between 1991 and 1999, 20 states increased the penalties for drug sale and manufacturing, as well as delivery. This is also coinciding with sort of the this is the whole goal, is to crack down on these sort of gangs or these drug lords that are bringing drugs in and distributing them. Note that most of these are black and brown men. Oh, here's the Just Say No campaign. This is Nancy Reagan in the picture. So the war on drugs was part of a larger conservative effort to take advantage of working class whites who were left out of the Democratic focus. It was part of this shrinking of welfare states, and so Clinton actually in the 90s had this welfare to workfare policy, and it was a law and order response to social unrest. Again, remember how when a lot of black folks lost their jobs in the 1970s, the welfare state was not equipped to handle that, and they kind of floundered for a while, and then, eventually people got welfare or they became incarcerated as the war on drugs started. Well, you also had folks who were trying to get on welfare for other reasons, and you see this increase in people trying to do that, and Clinton established that if you want to be on welfare, you have to work. And they established a lot of punishments for people who didn't work a minimum number of hours, or who didn't establish a set income, or who failed to appear to this, XYZ ridiculous thing. And so they would incarcerate people for any number of petty reasons. This was a very law and order response to the social unrest of the civil rights movement post-Vietnam War, those disillusioned boomers, and the quote-unquote inner city black folks losing their jobs in the 1970s. So there's a lot of social unrest. Well, the response to that was law and order rather than rehabilitation. There was a rise of crack in association with the inner city, so drug fears were focused on poor and black communities. White America was threatened. And of course, the media takes this and runs with it. There are 8 million PSAs on YouTube about, just say no to drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Dare to not do drugs. There's a whole bunches of them. So, a little bit more detail on welfare to workfare. The 1990s had welfare reforms. Basically, the federal government gave block grants to states, and they were designed to promote self-sufficiency. So states had control of the money to give to welfare recipients as needed. Now, to qualify for assistance, one had to work and follow strict requirements or face penalties like incarceration or fees. And if they couldn't pay the fees, then they would be incarcerated. The issue, again, was that people lost their jobs in the 70s, and the application process to get welfare was ridiculously difficult. Jobs that people qualified for were often minimum wage, so you weren't making a lot of money anyway. And states could use those grants for other programs, and they would entice folks to leave people off welfare. The grants could be used for other things. So, to tie this all together, because I swear I'm not on a tangent, you have public aid and incarceration are tools for managing the quote-unquote unruly poor. Note that these unruly poor are usually not white, and this is done to mollify the poor white folks who have frequently been left out of the political conversation that's dominated by rich white folks. Rich folks like to turn poor folks against each other by using race. So they did that by increasing the requirements needed for public aid for new folks who were trying to apply to it, black folks, and by increasing incarceration for small amounts of drug use. Welfare became criminalized as prisons, quote-unquote, welcomed more low-income folks who once would have received social services. So social services were really popular. We used it in the Depression for white women and their children, but as soon as you have black folks trying to use it, there's again this crackdown. So we have the civil rights backlash. White folks are fearing black folks because they're not used to this level of unrest. There are no jobs. People are losing their jobs in the 1970s. There's this drug market happening because, again, people are losing jobs, or the government's trying to crack down on drugs, and so there's this big black market. There's law and order platforms going on politically. There's increased policing as we've got this crackdown and this war on drugs, and there's welfare to workfare policies. This leads to a major prison boom. White folks are fearing black folks who lost their jobs and are trying to get by in life by applying to welfare. Well, they can't apply to welfare because there's strict requirements, and so they become incarcerated. At the same time, there's a war on drugs because white folks fear black folks. So we see all of this adding together to this huge prison boom in the late 21st century. So from the 1970s to the 1980s, we went from 150 people per 100,000 to 300 per 100,000 people incarcerated. That again doubled from the 1980s to the 1990s. As of 2007, we had a rate of 767 people per 100,000 incarcerated in the United States. Interestingly, crime rates have moved independently of these incarceration rates. So the violent crime rate actually peaked in the early 90s, and it's been going down steadily since then. So for 30 years, it's been going down, which I can't believe the 90s were 30 years ago, but it's been going down since the 90s. But the imprisonment rate continued to go up into the 2000s, and only now is it really starting to go down a little bit. So as of 2015-ish, so these stats might be a little bit out of date, roughly 2.3 million people were incarcerated in some form, whether it's jails, prisons, parole, probation, some other sort of incarceration. The United States is less than 5% of the world's population, but if you think of all of the people who are incarcerated, people from the United States represent a quarter of the incarcerated population. We are number one. This is not something we should be proud of. This chart shows incarceration rates among founding North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. The United States has the highest rate by far, more than the rest of them combined almost. And of course, this incarceration, again, separates the us from the them. The U.S. population on the left shows the population of white, black, Latino, and Native folks in the country. White folks are at 64%, Latinos are at 16%, blacks are at 13%, and Native folks are just under 1%. If you look at how many or what proportion of those folks are incarcerated, it's black folks at 40%, white folks at 39%, Latinos at 19%, and Natives at 1%. So white folks are underrepresented in the incarcerated population, while black folks are overrepresented. If you've ever taken a criminal justice course before at UIC, this is probably no surprise to you, but hopefully you kind of know the context for the high incarceration rates of black and brown men in this country. So, of course, these have some long-lasting impacts. This might not be accurate now, but as of a couple years ago, there are more black men under correctional control than were enslaved in 1850. So you might have heard of the book The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. She basically talks about how mass incarceration is another form of slavery. There are several socioeconomic impacts. Joblessness. If you are convicted of a felony, you're going to have a really hard time getting a job. You're going to have a really hard time getting housing. You're going to have a hard time voting. You're going to have familial impact. There's going to be a lot of stigma. The loss of ability to vote. There's this inherited incarceration. And so if you're incarcerated, your kids might be more likely to be incarcerated as well. So this becomes structural violence. Pardon me. So this becomes structural violence. Pardon me. Had a little hiccup with the slides there, in which you have this, these vast swaths of black and brown men getting incarcerated. Their kids see them becoming incarcerated. They might be more likely to be incarcerated as well because of structures that have been set up to criminalize black and brown men in this country. So there was a lot going on in this lecture, which is why I'm really sorry I missed it, because it is really better off being done in class, but I want you to get this information. So if you have any questions on structural violence, please send me an email. Your class activity will be online. Everything is up on Blackboard. It'll be released at class time, so you have all this information. We're going to look at structural violence in a slightly different way. So we looked at incarceration today. On Thursday, you're going to look at structural violence in terms of things like housing or food instability or education, just so you can get a broad base of what structural violence really looks like in this country. So again, if you have other questions or other issues, please let me know. I won't be, in the state, but I'll still have access to email, and I'll be back sometime Thursday afternoon, so I can come in on Friday if I need to. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, and thank you for listening.